Hello, this is Angelia, and you are listening to or watching the podcast, Why You Do, What You Do. The podcast that's about development, human development, and psychology to kind of try and help you figure out a little more about why you do what you do. And last time we were talking about development. It involves a changing allocation of resources. So we're going to pick up from there. In childhood and young life, as the total available pool of resources typically goes to growth. And, that's growing up. In old age, to regulation of loss. Because as we age, we're going to start losing things. We're going to start losing physical abilities. Maybe your hair, your eyesight, your hearing, your teeth, and your muscle tone. So, you're going to have to learn to compensate for the losses of these things. In midlife, the allocation is more evenly balanced among the three functions, because that's usually when we're at our peak, between 30 and 60, that's usually your peak. And, we're usually on our ball, succeeding in what we're doing in life. And so our body and mind is just kind of going with the flow. Development is modifiable. We talked about that earlier, how you can change it. Allergies. There are limitations to that. You can change it with interventions, but if you don't get certain things at certain times, you never really get caught up. Throughout life, development shows plasticity, meaning, there is some wiggle room. You can learn things later on that you didn't learn earlier. Many abilities such as memory, strength, and endurance can be significantly improved with training and practice, even late in life. Sometimes we do have deficits. And, like I said, learning languages, working crossword puzzles or whatever can help train your mind. And like if you had a stroke or an accident or whatever, you might want to go to physical therapy to bring your body back to where it was before. So we can play catch up in certain areas. However, as Eachard learned, even in children, the potential for change has limits. And we're going back to poor old Victor, the wild boy. He didn't learn his language earlier in life, so in later life, he could only come out with a few word sentences, because there's a certain area of age where your brain is plastic enough and it's trying to learn these things, because, that's what's going on around it. And once you get older, you lose that ability. One of the tasks of developmental research is to discover to what extent particular kinds of development can be modified at various ages. And this is so that they can implement some interventions with children who are, having deficits in certain areas. Because unfortunately, there is abuse and neglect, and this can give a child not as good a start as the other children had, but they're hoping to be able to give them, some interventions that can help them catch up. Development is influenced by the historical and cultural context, what happened before and the culture you're living in now. Each person develops within multiple contexts. Everything, like I said, everything that you experience affects you in some kind of ways. There's not just one thing, not just nature, not just nurture. Everything you experience is going to affect you in some way. Circumstances or conditions defined in part by biology, which is what you inherit from your parents, in part by time and place, the time you grow up in. Like I said, the people who grew up in the 30s have a much different view on things than the people who grew up in the 50s. And they have a different view on things than the people who grew up in the 70s. So it does depend on the time you grew up in and the place where you were in, whether you were in an urban area, a suburban area, or a rural area. In addition to age-graded and non-normative influences, human beings, as we have noted, influence and are influenced by their historical, cultural context. So you are influenced by everything that's ever happened to you, the place you grew up in, and the time you grew up in. As we discuss, the developmental scientists have found significant cohort differences in intellectual functioning in women's midlife emotional development and in the flexibility of personality in old age. So everyone does not function equally intellectually. There are people who never go beyond an 100 IQ. There are people who go beyond that, well beyond that. And that doesn't mean that this person didn't have good development. That just might be their brain capacity. This doesn't mean that this person had a good development. That just must be their brain capacity. Because there can be people from great loving homes who don't have high IQs, and there can be people who come from abusive and neglective homes who do have high IQs. So that's just something that you probably inherit. Women's midlife emotional development. Women become more, you hear about the IQ, EQ. Women become more emotionally developed when we hit middle age. Because when we're young, we're looking for a mate and, all that stuff that we do. But as you become in midlife, you start having children. Things become more important to you, like the world in general, what's going on, how it affects your children, and then your grandchildren, and you become more emotionally mature in midlife. Now, there are tales about men who do not experience that. And that's when a lot of problems start happening in marriages, because the woman is becoming more emotionally mature, trying to raise and take care of the future generations, while the man feels left out. Oh, she just doesn't pay any attention to me now. She pays only attention to the kids. Man, grow up. So that's kind of a war between the sexes on that one. Whereas women are becoming more emotionally mature, sometimes men revert back to before they were, bonding with a partner and becoming more mature as an adult. I'm sure you know all the jokes about men's midlife crisis, so I'm not going to go telling any. But the flexibility of personality in old age. As you get older, you're more willing to think and experience things differently. Now, that's not everyone. There are some older people who get very set in their ways. This is how it is. This is how I like it. This is how it's going to be. But more people become more flexible and are willing to look at things more. As we get older, and how we have grandchildren, they look at things a certain way. We're like, oh, well, I hadn't thought about that. That does make some sense. And, we start being more open to more experiences as we get older. And that's in general. Like I said, don't think, oh, no, but that's in general. There are people who get old and they're stubborn and set in their ways, and that's that. Okay, and we're going to go back to a story about, I mentioned when we were talking about Victor, Jeannie. And now we're going to talk about Jeannie's story. Physically speaking, how important is timing in language acquisition? In 1970, a 13-and-a-half-year-old girl called Jeannie, and that's not her real name, was discovered in a suburb in Los Angeles. She had been confined for nearly 12 years to a small room in her parents' home, tied to a potty chair, and cut off from normal human contact. So to say this child was abused and neglected is putting it mildly. She weighed only 59 pounds, could not straighten her arms or legs, could not chew, had no bladder or bowel control, and did not speak because she was never taught to do any of those things. She was tied to a potty chair and treated basically like an animal. She recognized only her own name and the word sorry. So that is pretty close to the saddest thing you've ever heard, because that's something she probably had to say to keep from probably getting beaten. It's just, I just hate hearing these stories. They just get right to me, because as a mom, you know, you just get angry at these parents and you just want to like do horrible things to them. Only 3 years before, Eric Lenneberg had proposed that there is a critical period for language acquisition, beginning in early infancy and ending around puberty. Lenneberg argued that it would be difficult, if not impossible, for a child who had not yet acquired language to do so after that age. The discovery of Jeannie offered the opportunity for a test of Lenneberg's hypothesis. So now again we have a poor child that becomes a science experiment. Could Jeannie be taught to speak, or was it too late? The National Institute of Mental Health funded a study, and a series of researchers took over Jeannie's care and gave her intensive testing and language training. So at least someone was taking care of her, and they felt like they were doing the right thing. Their intentions were good. Jeannie's progress during the next few years, before the NIM withdrew funding and her mother regained custody and cut her off from contact with the professionals who had been teaching her. So here we have this problem that this child who became a science experiment was being taken care of by these people. She learned from these people. She probably trusted these people. But when the funding for this experiment was cut off, her mother got her back. She went back to her mother, who had locked her in a room on a potty chair for 12 and a half years. Both challenges and supports the idea of a critical period for language acquisition. Jeannie did learn some simple words and could string them together into primitive but rule-governed sentences. So, since she missed that opportune age to learn language, it was really hard for her. She also learned the fundamentals of sign language, but she never used language normally, and her speech remained, for the most part, like a somewhat garbled telegram. So, you know, that's a shame that, you know, this child was neglected. Clearly the child might have had some mental disabilities, but to be basically tied to a potty chair till you're 12 and a half years old, I mean, that's absolute neglect and abuse in my opinion. When her mother, unable to care for her, turned her over to a series of abusive foster homes, she regressed into total silence. So here this progress that was made, and her mother, who, you know, wanted her back, decided she couldn't take care of her and put her into foster homes where she was abused. So of course she stopped talking. What explains Jeannie's initial progress and her inability to sustain it? The fact that she was just beginning to show signs of puberty at age 13 and a half may indicate that she was still in the critical period, though near its end. And also it could just be that, you know, she was being abused, so she didn't want to talk to these people. The fact that she apparently had learned a few words before being locked up at the age of 20 months may mean that her language learning mechanisms may have been triggered, early in the critical period, allowing later learning to occur. And that's just, again, a hypothesis. Like I said, it might have been that, you know, she didn't want to speak. On the other hand, the fact that she was so abused and neglected may have retarded her so much emotionally, socially, and cognitively that, like Victor, the wild boy of Aveyron, she cannot be considered a true test of the critical period. Case studies like those of Jeannie and Victor dramatize the difficulty of acquiring language after the early years of life. But because there are too many complicating factors, they do not permit conclusive judgment about whether such acquisition is possible, because of the severe neglect of Victor out in the wild and neglect and abuse of Jeannie, being tied to a potty chair for 12.5 years of her life. Recent brain imaging research has found that even if the parts of the brain best suited to language processing are damaged early in childhood, nearly normal language development can continue as other parts of the brain take over. In fact, shifts in brain organization and utilization occur throughout the course of normal language learning. And that's why, it's good to know that if part of your brain gets damaged, the other part will help it out. And that's, some of the things I joke about is when I was like, oh, wait a minute, that connection's burned out, my brain's going to make a new one. Because stuff, that happens like that, brain injuries, strokes, or whatever, they can debilitate you. But because your brain is plastic, as we heard throughout life, it can play catch up and, get things back to where they're functional to a certain degree. Neuroscientists also have observed different patterns of brain activity during language processing in people who learned American Sign Language as a native language and those who learned it as a second language after puberty. I know some sign language. I know the alphabet. I had a deaf boyfriend years ago, and it behooved me to learn that because he could sign so much faster than I could understand, that I asked for help from his sister so that I can understand what he was saying. It is possible to learn a second language, signed or spoken, even in adulthood, but typically not as easily or as well as in early childhood. I can attest to that from trying to learn Spanish. Because of the brain's plasticity, some researchers consider the prepubertal years a sensitive rather than critical period for learning language. And that means, that it's easier then, but not necessarily necessary then. Because, as we've seen, if you do not get that at an earlier age, it is much harder to learn it. But if either a critical or sensitive period for language learning exists, what explains it? Do the brain's mechanisms for acquiring language decay as the brain matures? That would seem strange since other cognitive abilities improve. An alternative hypothesis is that this very increase in cognitive sophistication interferes with an adolescent's or adult's ability to learn a language. So by the time you start becoming a teenager, other things are going on. You're starting to want to be more like others. You're starting to mature physically. So your brain's chemicals and hormones are putting the effort in there and not so much anymore in learning a language. Young children acquire language in small chunks that can be readily digested. Older learners, when they first begin learning a language, tend to absorb a great deal all at once and then may have trouble in analyzing and interpreting it. Like I know, like I said, from studying Spanish, I get confused on different words. I think this word means this, and then when I put it there, they're like, nope, and then they're like, oh, yeah, you're right, it means this other thing. So it can be confusing. So your children need that language learning is early after toddlerhood or in the middle toddlerhood from like 3 to 9, in order to become proficient at language as an adult. Okay. And now that you've had a brief introduction to the field of human development and some of its basic concepts, it's time to look more closely at the issues developmental scientists think about and how they do their work. We'll discuss some influential theories of how development takes place and the methods investigators commonly use to study it. So we're going to go over a little summary here in key terms. How the study of human development evolved, what is human development, and how is its study evolved. Human development is the scientific study of processes of change and stability. The scientific study of human development began with studies of childhood during the 19th century. Adolescence was not considered a separate phase of development until the 20th century, when scientific interest in aging also began. As researchers became interested in following development through adulthood, lifespan development became a field of study. And that's human development and lifespan development became a thing. Human development today, an introduction to the field. What are the 4 goals of the scientific study of human development? And what do developmental scientists study? The study of human development seeks to describe, explain, predict, and modify development. Ways of studying human development are still evolving, making use of advanced technologies. Developmental research has important applications. Developmental scientists study developmental change, both quantitative and qualitative, as well as stability of personality and behavior. So again, we're talking about quantitative change and qualitative change. How many change? What type of change? What are the 3 major domains and 8 periods of human development? The 3 major domains of development are physical, cognitive, and psychosocial. Each affects the others. The concept of periods of development in a social construction, the lifespan is divided into 8 periods. The prenatal period, infancy and toddlerhood, early childhood, middle childhood, adolescence, young adulthood, middle adulthood, and late adulthood. In each period, people have characteristic developmental needs and tasks. So we're talking about physical development, cognitive development, which is your mental development, psychosocial development, and social construction. Influences on your development. What kinds of influences make one person different from another? Influences on development come from both heredity and environment. Many typical changes during childhood are related to maturation. Individual differences increase with age. In some societies, the nuclear family predominates. In others, the extended family. Socioeconomic status affects developmental processes and outcomes through the quality of home and neighborhood environments, or also of nutrition, medical care, supervision, and schooling. The most powerful neighborhood influences seem to be neighborhood income and human capital. Multiple risk factors increase the likelihood of poor outcomes. Other important environment influences stem from ethnicity, culture, and historical context. In large multi-ethnic societies, immigrant groups may adapt to the dominant culture while preserving aspects of their own. Influences may be normative, age-graded or history-graded, or non-normative. There is evidence of critical or sensitive periods for certain kinds of early development. Let's talk about individual differences, heredity, environment, maturation, the nuclear family, extended family, socioeconomic status, risk factors, culture, ethnic group, normative, cohort, non-normative, imprinting, critical period, and sensitive periods. So those are words you could look up if you want to know more about those. Baltes' lifespan development approach. What are the 6 principles of the lifespan developmental approach? The 6 principles of Baltes' lifespan developmental approach are: 1. Development is lifelong. 2. Development involves both gain and loss. 3. The relative influence of biology and culture shift over the lifespan. 4. Development involves a changing allocation of resources. 5. Development is modifiable. Bleh. And 6. Development is influenced by the historical and cultural context. So these are all things that affect your development. All right, so we're going to move on and talk about theory and research. There is one thing even more vital to science than intelligent methods, and that is the sincere desire to find out the truth, whatever it may be. That was by Charles Sanders Peirce. Focus. Margaret Meade, pioneer in cross-cultural research. Margaret Meade was a world-famous American anthropologist. In the 1920s, at a time when it was rare for a woman to expose herself to the rigors of field work with remote, pre-illiterate peoples, Meade spent 9 months on the South Pacific island of Samoa, studying girls' adjustment to adolescence. Her best-selling first book, Coming of Age in Samoa, challenged accepted views about the inevitability of adolescent rebellion. So, you know, in those years, that was rare to have a woman scientist going and, you know, studying other cultures. So she was ahead of her time. An itinerant childhood built around her parents' academic pursuits prepared Meade for a life of roving research. In New Jersey, her mother, who was working on her doctoral thesis in sociology, took Margaret along on interviews with recent Italian immigrants, the child's first exposure to field work. And so her mother was an exceptional person as well, and I'm sure that influenced her development to be one as well for her time. Her father, a professor at the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton Business School, taught her respect for facts and the importance of thinking clearly. So again, she had an exceptional father as well. So from these 2 exceptional parents came an exceptional child. He stressed the link between theory and application, as Margaret did when, years later, she applied her theories of child rearing to her daughter. Margaret's grandmother, a former school teacher, sent her out into the woods to collect and analyze mint specimens. I was not well drilled in geography or spelling, Meade wrote in her memoir, Blackberry Winter, but I learned to observe the world around me and to note what I saw. And that's something that we all should be doing. Observe the world around you and kind of take a note of what you're seeing. Because that's how we learn about the world around us. Margaret took copious notes on the development of her younger brother and 2 younger sisters. Can you imagine? Her curiosity about why one child in a family behaved so differently from another led to her later interest in temperamental variations within a culture. And that would have been really interesting. I never even thought about that, but my brother and sister were pretty different in temperament, and I was different from them. So that would have probably been an interesting study. My goodness. How cultures define male and female roles was another research focus. Margaret saw her mother and her grandmother as educated women who had managed to have husbands, children, and professional careers. And so she expected to do the same. She was dismayed when, at the outset of her career, The distinguished anthropologist Edward Sapir told her she would do better to stay at home and have children than to go off to the South Seas to study adolescent girls. So clearly he was a sexist. Margaret's choice of anthropology as a career was consistent with her homebred respect for the value of all human beings and their cultures. And that's what we should all have. Unfortunately, that is not something happening here in these days, as we should respect all human beings and their cultures. That doesn't mean you have to agree with them, but Jesus said you should love them, but you could at least respect them. That's them. That's not me. You know, I can talk to them about what I believe, but in the end, you should respect them and their cultures. Recalling her father's insistence that the only thing worth doing is to add to the store of knowledge, she saw an urgent need to document once isolated cultures now vanishing before the onslaught of modern civilization. And that's something that, you know, we do as teachers. We're trying to add to the knowledge base of society, at least good teachers. You know, I ain't gonna get into that. But there were people, like the people of the Pacific Islands, who were very innocent, who had a very nature-based way of living, and then Western society kind of came and took them over. And of course, that's going to be an adjustment. It's like suddenly you have a new God, you have a new way you're supposed to think, you have a new way you're supposed to feel, you have new things you're supposed to do physically or look physically. That's got to be, you know, a major culture shock. I went to Samoa, as later I went to the other societies on which I have worked, to find out more about human beings. Human beings like ourselves, everything except their culture, she wrote. Through the accidents of history, these cultures have developed so differently from ours that knowledge of them could shed a kind of light upon us, upon our potentialities and our limitations. The ongoing quest to illuminate those potentialities and limitations is the business of theorists and researchers in human development. So what she saw was, you know, a culture that basically was being, you know, enveloped into another culture. And so she wanted to study this and learn, you know, their old ways versus the new ways that were, you know, being put on them that they had to learn. And, you know, clearly she was a good scientist, and she might have even been a good teacher. So, you know, this is why people study human development, so that we can learn from everything that has happened before us and learn why things are happening the way they're happening, so that, you know, that will help you. And in this case, hopefully, it can help you figure out why you do what you do. That's it for now. Till next time.